Welcome back, friends and fellow philosophers and authors, to this Wild Isle writing cast. I have back with me Brad, also known as Wraith of the Kings of Wrath. How are you doing, Brad?
Pretty good, thanks. And not to be pedantic, but it's King's Wrath.
Oh, King's Wrath. Oh, I got it wrong. How could I'm so embarrassed. King's Wrath. You can find the music out on YouTube. Look them up. Power metal. It is awesome. I did not appreciate the genre until Brad here exposed me to it, and I'm very, very happy that he did. Have you come out with anything else since the last time we spoke, Brad?
No, just the demos we have on YouTube. We're kind of stalled right now with needing to put a full lineup together. But as soon as we have something else ready to go, I'll put the word out.
Awesome. I cannot wait for it. And I'm sure the rest of our listeners cannot wait either, or for this podcast for that matter. But you're going to have to, because it is time that we shill very shortly. Before we get into the bureaucratic death of magic, before then, I'm going to direct you all to wildislelit.com for a number of things. First and foremost, you can check out my novel, Wand Smoke Broken, weird fantasy fiction Western-esque American twist literary thing. Look at that. It's awesome. A bigger announcement, though, is I have just added a few new or really redesigned packages for my editing service. So I have two streamlined packages that are similar to what I've always had, word count, line style edits, and theme focused edits for a set chunk price. But I am now also able to offer a subscription service. So if you are someone who benefits from having somebody else, keep you in line, keep you accountable, and you want someone to help coach you through your writing, going over a smaller chunk where you don't have to pay as much up front, you can hire me for that over at the Wild Isle Style Guide. Other than that, we have podcasts over there, blogs, aphorisms, which the past couple weeks I'm kind of proud of. Brad, by the way, also writes aphorisms. You should check those out. Brad, why don't you show some things? Where can people find you and check out your work?
Aside from my band, which you've already mentioned, I really don't have too much to shill. I guess I can mention my Minds page again. It'll be minds.com/codename Wraith. Side note, I have read One Smoke Broken. I'm working on a review of it, which should be posted there by the time this podcast goes live. So if any of you want to hear my thoughts on, or read my thoughts rather on that book, that'll be over there on my Minds page.
And please do, oh, friends, fellow philosophers and authors, tell or don't tell, but you can tell me what you think of what Brad thought. I hope Brad won't roast me too badly. I can't wait to see it, really. Thank you so much for reading. Uh, Without further ado, let's get into today's topic. So, the bureaucratic death of magic. Are magic systems still magical? I think, Brad, before we can really begin this conversation, we have to ask and answer the question, what is magic and what is magic in fiction? So when I say that word magic in the context of fiction or a story, or we can extend this on to film or games or whatever you want, what is magic?
I think to answer that, I could probably just go ahead and refer to an aphorism I wrote a little while ago. You would have seen it on my Minds page on my Instagram. I'll just read it verbatim. This is pretty much my condensed thoughts on what I think magic should be in fiction. What is magic? Often an attempt to manifest one's will to power or the service of a greater one. Regardless of intent, what manifests will be an accurate reflection of the magician's soul. Some are strong or self-deceiving enough to cope with this truth, others not so. Thus, there can be no banality or mediocrity in magic. Its execution can only be demonic or divine. If we want to go something a little more, cut and dry, I went ahead and looked up a dictionary definition where one here on Wiktionary, the application of rituals or actions, especially those based on occult knowledge, to subdue or manipulate natural or supernatural beings and forces in order to have some benefit from them.
Both of those are really, really interesting uh, in the same way, and are actually, I think, very different from how a lot of listeners might be conceiving of magic, right? And I actually, both definitions that you gave line right up with where I eventually want to jump into.
Yeah, my the first one, my aphorism is really my condensed as condensed as it can possibly be, my thoughts on what magic should be, and then of course you've got a basic dictionary definition, which might be more broadly applicable, for lack of a better term.
It can be, but actually, maybe I should dive in right here first. Okay, so there is a tight overlap between your aphorism and that more traditional definition. So I guess before we talk about fiction specifically, let's really dive in with this with magic because I think it's a really interesting conversation. So when it mentioned the occult and the appeal to beings outside oneself to gain some type of benefit, right? That is actually not typical, I think, of magic in fiction, but is really typical of historical practices of magic and magic as it appears in mythology and folklore quite a lot of the time. And I think there is a through line there that I'm going to throw out to you. You can tell me if this makes sense to you. But the idea that magic as it manifests across cultures, across time, as being an appeal to a thing external to the self is, in a weird way, the I don't want to say positive, that's not really the right word. It's one side of the dialectic that your aphorism points out, right? Because your aphorism talks about the, let's say, magician's soul and his will to power and how that manifests. And one line of the dialectic, I think, appeals to that which is outside the self, right? So that which is the object, as opposed to the self, which is the subject. And I think the other side of that dialectic is the appeal to the subject. And we could get into subjectivity and objectivity um, here in a bit and how that relates to a beneficent appeal to magic or a let's say, nihilistic appeal to magic. I know these things probably sound totally out there and disconnected before I wrap them all together. What do you think so far? Do you see the little threads in the way that they perhaps are touching?
I'm not sure I do because whether trying to channel magic, whether that's actually an external thing or not, I guess depends on what setting we're talking about. Where in some settings it's going to be like my aphorism. I think I mentioned in my aphorism, yeah, divine or demonic. Where in some settings it's going to, in some settings, some forms of magic will be from God, some will be from the devil. You could look at Star Wars, for example, where they cite the Force as this strange otherworldly thing where it's outside of you, but at the same time, Obi-Wan Kenobi's words in A New Hope, where it says the Force, it surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together. So it's almost like it's getting at a we are all one sort of thing in there. So yeah, I'm not sure where to go with that.
All right, let's see if I can wrap these threads together then, because this I didn't expect to have this thought, and it is not intuitive. So let us think of magic as being being represented, let's say in fiction. We'll even tie that in two different ways. Because I've noticed that magic can either be a kind of wish fulfillment and power fantasy in a sense, right? Like the ability to do that which one just can't do in real life. I've spoken to people who have said to me explicitly that the appeal of magic and the appeal of fantasy to them is precisely that they can experience a sense of power or secondhand, of course, or that they can see wishes be fulfilled. But also, I have seen magic be a kind of symbolic explanation, right? You really see this with mythology when any folkloric thing where the supernatural or the magical elements are really there to help explain something through the connotation of the symbol itself. And by doing that, it is making reference to the truth of reality rather than presenting a setting that is opposed to reality, right? And without having to go on too long, I think actually that the idea that the magic can be an appeal to the external world, the object. It can be to forces that are beyond ourselves that we hope to benefit from, but ultimately don't have control over. I think that lines up with the idea of the myth. I think that lines up with the idea of the world as a place which has a transcendent, objective, fundamental backstop that binds us all together, like the Force, right? Like there is a thing that transcends our individual desires and wills and experiences versus a kind of, let's say, black magic, if you will. And black magic's not really applicable to a setting. Don't think of it that way. Think of it in terms of the dialectic, right? So you've got magic that is presented in the setting merely to, let's say, indulge the reader in pleasure in a fantasy that does not teach them about the transcendent world through the connotation of symbols, but teaches them to escape into a world that doesn't exist, into a nowhere, right? Um, as because the magic in the setting allows them to pretend in the subjectivity of their minds that they are somewhere else. Does that make a little bit more sense? I was hoping to articulate that out and make those connections a little clearer.
I believe it does. You're distinguishing between the more traditional view of magic and folklore, whereas you say it's meant to be analogous to something real. It's meant to teach a lesson about the real world. Whereas I guess in a lot of modern stories, it can end up being really just little more than shallow wish fulfillment.
Yeah. Uh, and do you think we should outline perhaps two different definitions of magic? Because very clearly we're not talking about the same thing with each one. They seem to be, in fact, quite opposed to one another. Uh, so if we play on your aphorism, right? So go ahead and, if you would, give us a definition of magic that is symbolic and a magic that isn't. How would you, if you had to sum each of those down into like a single sentence, if you could, how would you do it?
You really put me on the spot here.
I'll go. How about I'll go first, and I'll do one. I'll do I'll do the symbolic, and I'll throw the wish fulfillment. I'll give myself the trickier one. So there is one type of magic that appears in fiction, and that type of magic is the, let's say, symbolic and connotative, uh, or actually, I'll flip those around. One definition of magic is the connotative symbols that that help to convey the theme of the work in which they are set, and are and while literally are opposed to how our reality works, they are figuratively in accord with how our reality works. Something like that. I think if I had to give one, the connotative symbols that make up a meta narrative. There we go. I think that boils the one down. Connotative symbols that make up a meta narrative. And we'll say that's the folkloric type of magic. And if we had to go with the other, the more shallower, the more wish fulfillment one, you want to give that one a shot? While you take your time to boil that down, listeners, think for yourselves. How would you out there define this type of shallow, indulgent, magical escapism?
To give a brief and not very well thought out definition, I would say that depending on how it's handled, it could be something like an expression of the author's own will to power. If that makes any sense.
It does make sense. Could I prod you into going on?
I'd have to think about it. I'm not great at coming up with these things on the spot.
No, it's perfectly fine. It'll get easier once you've dove deeper into Nietzsche. If you guys don't know, Brad has picked up a little Nietzsche reader book, and I'm very excited about it. Uh,
You can
but
thank or blame Marquise for that, depending on your view.
yeah, but no, I think you actually hit the nail on the head, right? We just need to specify it a little bit. So I think if we boil down our shallower, perhaps more modern sense of magic, it is the uh, wish fulfillment of the reader and perhaps the author's will to power. Um, let's say, haha, let's just go full Nietzschean about it. It is the moral slave's will to power. That's what it is, right? Because it is a view of the world in which the world is deficient and it is made better by the wish fulfillment there, put there. So it's like saying the world is not as it really should be, and it really ought to be how it is represented here, right? According to my will, how I want it to be. Again, pulling back to the subjective. I think we'll get more and more into this as we further the conversation. I'm sure the people out there listening are like, what is this deep philosophy? I thought we were talking about magic systems, right? Because we haven't touched on the system part of this conversation yet. So when I attach the word system to magic, how does that change things?
Well, it suggests you're setting up for lack of a better term, a set of rules and regulations around magic too. So you're specifying exactly, you're categorizing the powers. This is something I probably should have thought of beforehand to have thought of a better definition of beforehand. But it seems to me it's sorting different expressions of magic into different categories in order to more rigidly define what one is capable of at any given time, depending on what their power level is and what resources they have to work with. I think the reason one might get so um, rigid in how they define these things is to keep that power level um, is to keep things to prevent things from spiraling out of control. Because if you don't have limitations on magic, it can easily become capable of anything, and then your story on it completely falls apart because then you can start asking questions at any given point. Well, why didn't they do this? If they were capable of doing it here, why didn't they do it there? And so on and so forth.
Yeah, so the system part of this is the limitations, essentially the borders of possibility. Um, now, I'm sure you're familiar with the terms soft magic and hard magic. Are you familiar with those?
Basically, the hard magic is more outward and obvious, and soft magic is more subtle and a little bit more vague, not so strictly defined, or at least is not capable of as much. Quick example would be Darth Vader in Star Wars. That hard magic is what he does is very obvious. He force choke and throw things around and sends people across the galaxy and all that. Whereas you've something more on the side of soft magic you have would be Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, perhaps. Uh,
I definitely see Gandalf as being soft, right? You're never quite sure what Gandalf is or is not capable of at any particular
mhm.
given moment. Though you might say the same thing for Darth Vader if you're just watching Star Wars for the first time. Um, I don't know that the limitations of his powers are very restricted at all. And I think it's only the fans who have come after the fact and logged, okay, what are every force power used? And then now we're going to say these are the things that can be done with the force type of deal, right? Because it's what we've seen been done. But I don't know if you just
Yeah,
have the first.
because that's the problem with Star Wars is that Star Wars has had is that the more people get their hands on it, the more the Force gets expanded and what it's capable of. Where it's George Lucas. I think Lucasfilms were pretty sensible about respecting the limitations of the Force, where it's this vague, not very well defined thing that's kind of beyond our understanding, but we can tap into it now and then in sometimes subtle, sometimes more grandiose ways, depending on how practiced the Force user in question is. But I'm trying to think of a good way to segue this. I mean, the like I said, the George Lucas films got really a handful of powers. You've got a handful of things the Force is capable of. It's like basic telekinesis, the lightning for the Sith magic, and choke, and some sort of vague sensory thing. I don't know exactly what to call it. But then in the sequel films, you have, oh, and now we can heal, now we can force heal, now we can Skype chat over the Force, now we can send objects across vast distances, we can teleport things for some reason. You have to respect the limitations, or else things are going to spiral out of control pretty fast.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I'm not quite sure that it is the expansion of what the Force was capable of that might have been the issue, as much as the what's the right word? Let's think of it this way, right? So we talked about the whether or not the limitations are up to the subject and his desires, his will to power, or whether the limitations are bound by symbolic representation. And I think what we see within the, let's say, the first few films is that the force powers used are used to be meaningful in some way, right? Like what the force does is it lets one move things out in the environment, and it is kind of in accord with uh, what the characters are like in their particular morality, right? So when you've got Luke picking his ship up out of the swamp, he is, let's say, moving obstacles out of his way, or moving things that he needs into positions where they would be useful, right? He can move things in the world, which is exactly like someone who has achieved a level of competence in his life, right? He can get things where they need to be. Um, he can propel himself when he needs to. That's like when he does his like the jump with over the pit. I can't remember what it's called. Uh, that Boba Fett falls into. The Star Wars fans are going to kill me for that. But he
Sarlacc pit.
has, yeah, the Sarlacc pit. Um, but he has this uncanny ability to do something that, in a sense, if we start speaking figuratively, that real successful heroic people have the ability to do. And Darth Vader's not, very different, right? Like he has really the same set of powers, but the way that they manifest, the choke being really symbolic, is the ability to strangle someone in a frightening manner, right? The, let's say, seeming immunity to attack, right? That's when he stops the, I think it's Lando's shot at him. And you do see people who are like that, these villainous people in the world who seem to just get away with, let's say, terrible circumstances and seem to be able to kill you without touching you, right? They give the order and you die. Um, it is merely their will. And I think that culminates in the idea of, let's say, lightning uh, with Palpatine, right? When you've got the raw expression of rage and wrath. Essentially, he's like an evil wizard, and he's wielding a weapon of the gods against you. I think that those things make sense intuitively and don't really need any explanation. And I actually don't even know that there is a need to consciously limit them because they just intuitively make sense. I think this concept of limitation, it reminds me quite a lot of game balance, right? Uh, like it starts to remind me of including numerics. And I actually think um, when magic systems in particular, if we want to think of them that way, the more systematized they become, the harder they become. And the harder they become, the the more they are strangely prone to the very problem that they are meant to solve. Um, Have I gone off on a limb here? I know I've been talking for a long time, but tell me what you think.
No, I think what you're getting at is when you try to lay out those rules, you inevitably end up expanding them further and further and further to, to account for every possible manifestation of every magician's will.
Yeah, it's essentially haha, this is a fun problem. Brad, I don't know if I've asked you this question. How many, if ever, tabletop RPGs have you played?
Old school pen and paper, I have actually never played one.
That is a shock to me. This might be applicable for other type of games. The question I'm about to ask. So, um, do you have any friends who happen to be like obsessive optimizers and power gamers?
Hmm, that I really know of. Not really.
I don't want to be rambling on too long, but I'll have to use an example from mine. I do. I've had a few, and one in particular who I have in my mind. And if you listen to this podcast, you know who you are. And when we get into this problem where a system, when you try to systemize a thing, it actually becomes exploitable. It's not exploitable if it is ethereal. But if you have hard numbers, someone with an autistic love of system mastery will figure out how to utilize that to its nth degree. And if you are not careful, let's say as an author, you very well may naturally fall into that exact problem where because you've because there is a very hard line in okay, here's how the magic works, if it's capable of this and not these other things, you run into a conflict in your plot, let's say. And what you end up doing is thinking in terms of how is it that my characters can master the system as to uh, you know essentially power game their abilities to overcome the obstacles in front of me. And I think that thought process is why you get this type of expansion, actually, right? Because it's like, okay, well, we've got the Force. Let's use that as an example. And the Force did not really seem to have any boundaries put upon it. So it seems to be the ability to uh, have, let's say, energy and the intention of the user put upon it. Okay, well, we've got these particular powers, right? So we've seen the lightning, we've seen the telekinesis. So all of a sudden now the force is being categorized into specific powers. Well, surely these aren't the only powers that the force could do, because why would it be? So because we've already started to systematize it, we've opened up the idea. Well, the force probably should, if I follow it logically, be able to do more things, right? Like why can't the force heal? Right, it would make sense if if we have the system of powers that it would be able to do that. Why can't the Force alter someone's mind? Why can't we send messages across space? Like, well, if I can shoot lightning, what's to say that it can't teleport something too? Because we're thinking about it in terms of, let's say, instead of what is the significance of this thing, it's like, well, if I don't have a reason now to say that it can't do this, then well, generating a new power out of the system, well, that's just how these systems work. I might be stretching it a little bit with Star Wars, but I do think that that mindset is what leads to the expansion, as opposed to it being soft.
Reflecting on this, I realized earlier I kind of contradicted myself where I referred to Star Wars as an example, hard magic, but then also talked about the vagueness of it. I think um, backtrack there. A better example would probably be like Harry Potter would be obvious hard magic because like it's very obvious that there's a lot of magic. There's a lot of different types of magic. There's a lot that it's capable of. Whereas I probably Star Wars and the Lord of the Rings would be better examples of soft magic where it's only used very circumstantially and heavily dependent on the person wielding it at the time.
Yeah, so that might be not the greatest example. If we move to literature, though, are you familiar with Shad M. Brooks' Shadow of the Conqueror?
I've heard of it. I've not read it.
Let's think. How about any of Brandon Sanderson's works?
Not read any Sanderson either.
Neither have I, but I do know that he has given quite a number of lectures on soft and hard magic systems when to use which. Um, Now, with his hard and soft magic system guidance, if we will, Sanderson outlines that the softer the magic, the less it can be used. Well, according to him, the less it can be used to resolve plot conflicts, but the harder the magic is, the more it can be used. And his argument goes that if you have a very hard magic system, the ingenuity of the characters utilizing the magic system as essentially a set of physics and resources is enough that it has a let's say satisfying payoff when they overcome the conflict. Whereas if it's a soft magic system and magic is how they resolve a conflict, it just feels like a wizard did it, right? If you're familiar with the meme.
Not heard of that meme, but I can understand the point being made there.
Yeah, and it really seems to make sense when you first hear it. I thought, okay, I buy into that. But as an author, I actually don't think, well, I don't think it's correct. What do you think? Like, it definitely sounds right. What's been your experience?
I have to think about that myself because I'm taking a in the story I'm working on now, I'm taking more of a soft approach to magic where there's only a handful of people that are capable of it, and what they are capable of depends highly on them as a character. So as to the point of, because I'm not sure how many of there's probably at least a few plot points that hinge on you might call magic. As for the point about, a wizard did it, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that one.
Yeah, well, if I think about this, right? So, unfortunately, look at us talking about magic, and neither of us has read the works that we're talking about. But I've seen the first of the Hobbit films, and one thing that struck me about that film, actually, I think I may have seen the first two. Doesn't matter. The point is that anytime Gandalf did anything, it did in fact feel as Brandon uh, Brandon Sanderson warned against, which is kind of arbitrary. Like it seemed like sometimes he was capable of really great feats, and like other times he had to resort to hitting someone with a stick, and it wasn't at all clear to me as a viewer why he would hit someone with a stick now and then like make a giant shockwave later. Um, However, as an author, when I deal with this problem, I actually notice, just like you pointed out, you tie in the character to the magic quite tightly, right? So it means that the character and the character's development and the limitations imposed on the character in the setting and in relationship to the other characters in the plot actually provide a set of limitations that provide a natural, intuitive set of boundaries for the soft magic. That I'm sure in the if I read the Hobbit novel, Gandalf's limitations of magic are probably bound up in the same way that just didn't get uh, let's say shown on the screen. I know that's very common of a problem. Uh, but it does seem to me that just like we outlined at the very beginning of the conversation, that once things start to get symbolic, once they start to become embedded in the meta narrative, the borders and the limitations are essentially like that which corresponds to the real world in some figurative way. And it just makes sense. And you don't run into a lot of these problems that you might run into with hard magic. Now, I know that we haven't read a whole lot of hard magic systems. I'm going to go back to Shad Ambrok's Shadow of the Conqueror. And the reason why I want to go back to that book is because it has a very, very, very hard magic system. So much so, actually, that I suspect that Shad himself might be um, a tad autistic. Maybe he's just like no, I'm not. I don't mean that disparagingly, but what I
Oh, no,
mean
I get
is,
it. I get it.
yeah. In fact, I think a lot of the critiques of his book, they're valid, but a lot of them come down to that this kind of autistic way of thinking about um, writing, where he really, really, really explicitly describes how the magic works. And it sounds like a video game. And it sounds like a video game in a number of ways, right? So in Shadow of a Conqueror, the magic system is tied to the light, which is basically God, and people have a number of bonds to the light. If they happen to have these bonds at all, most people don't, but some are lucky and they get
We're
them.
literally getting into numbers now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Literally numbers, right? Like it's almost as bad as a lit RPG. Um, and you start to think like, okay, what does that mean? He's got four bonds to the light, and then each bond he can link somehow. Because I don't know what it means to link one of these bonds, because now we're talking about a non-material entity that exists. Does it exist in the body? Is this like mind body dualism, but like light bond body dualism? Because they link to physical attributes, but the physical attributes are conceptions that we have of as human beings, of things that we categorize in the real world. So like he could link a bond to his speed, but like you can already kind of see where this is going wrong, right? Because what is speed? Right? Speed is not its own thing. Or he can make himself stronger. He could make, let's say, himself more perceptive, and then it even works multiplicit like as a multiplier. So as he puts one bond on an attribute, if he stacks another bond, it doubles the previous number, right? So it's like an exponential growth. Um,
Hmm.
and he ends up alert, he ends up fighting someone who's essentially as strong as him, and he ends up beating them by figuring out that he could link his four bonds to his skill as a swordsman, which in real life is normally impossible to get up to. Let's say the fourth power of more skill than someone, because we get this kind of diminishing returns. But then he can predict every single movement and becomes such a much better swordsman. He's impossible to defeat. Um, and it's really unsatisfying, right? Because it's like, so, so we just played like building a D&D character basically, and then putting your buffs in the right spot. And therefore I win. And you can see how what that did is we ended up by putting hard limits on how the magic worked. We ended up with the most overpowered character in that way, right? It wasn't the other way around. It wasn't that the magic was soft. It was that the magic was hard. And then therefore we get into this mindset is, how can I exploit this to the absolute advantage?
Hmm. Hmm.
Right, right, yeah.
The
Um,
more regimented you get in your thinking, your approach to that, the more likely that is to occur.
Yeah, I can think of exceptions though, right? Like I can reference Shad's work as well, where he has this whole system of like light affecting dark stone and the way the gravity works, and so people build ships using it, and it's really interesting actually. But now we're almost talking about like science fantasy.
Yeah, that
Now we're
goes into magic kind of replacing technology or magic becoming something analogous to technology. It's almost taking a really scientific approach to magic. It was when you start breaking things down like that, and I think that's there's got to be some mystery there, something mystical about it, something otherworldly, and as I said, my aphorism, divine or demonic. I don't like the one area where it probably works is alchemy, but aside from that, I think a scientific approach to magic is ill advised.
I actually have a bugbear about alchemy. Because as far as I can tell, like alchemy typically is like magic chemistry, as it's represented in a lot of fantasy. And that's exactly wrong, right? Like I hate to say this, but like Full Metal Alchemist, how they do alchemy is way closer to how actual alchemists did alchemy. Uh, like they were still dealing with like different elements and chemicals or whatever, but they really were like drawing the freaking circle and like summoning the demon so that they could converse with it. And it was like all this occult practice while you were throwing like maybe a couple things together, but it was fundamentally, and also they believed like you had to freaking transmute your own soul and like elevate your soul to a higher plane in order to do the actual alchemy here on Earth, which gets lost.
Apotheosis.
Um, Apotheosis. I don't.
Isn't that what that is, or am I thinking of something different?
It may be. I need to do more research into alchemy specifically. I have a tertiary knowledge of it from Yoon, but I have some particular books specifically about alchemy from Yoon, along with the actual, like I've got like the Corpus Hermetica and then a bunch of other old alchemical books that I need to read. I've tried to get into them before, but it's literally an acid trip. Like I think some dude like Turk or God or psilocybin and then wrote the shit down. And like, I'm not kidding. Um, which is actually why I think there's a lot of rich symbolism in there, by the way. So if you want to be a modern day alchemist, like take DMT like hard and then ask the elves like how to make the philosopher's stone and just write it all down.
That's the case.
Um,
Joe Rogan's gonna live forever.
if he figured out that's what he needs to ask the elves, one of us need to get on Joe Rogan and tell him that what he needs to do is DMT or maybe psilocybin because it'll last longer. Like DMT, typically free base is like 15 minutes, right? I don't know. I've never used any of these substances, even though I kind of want
Or
to.
I swear, officer.
No, I'm unfortunately like the nerdiest straight edge. Well, I was a kid, and then as an adult, kind of stayed that way. So I'm
Yeah,
lacking in the
likewise.
transcendental. Yeah, I'm envious of the Elucidian mysteries. Well, at least the hallucinogenic part, not so much the like sex orgy part of that particular ritual. Um,
Yeah, that's how things get out of hand.
yeah, yeah, yeah. All right, back to back to magic, right? But yeah, I didn't want to just bash all on hard magic because if we read a science fiction novel. I do think that that is, in a sense, the kind of hard magic that we were just talking about. Like, because it's like magical technology. It's technology that has an element that we've kind of added into it to make it work, or really just didn't describe to make it work. Um, would you think that's a fair comparison to compare hard magic to how the settings of science fantasy stories are constructed, or science fiction, rather?
All right, hard magic and science fiction.
Yeah, I think essentially at their essence, they're the same thing.
I guess in the sense that it's a that regimented approach that you're taking to things and trying to I guess that would make sense if you think of hard magic as I alluded to before, the scientific approach to things where you're trying to very rigorously categorize and define everything and what it's all capable of. I guess you could argue there's a similar mindset going on there.
Yeah, it's like the magic is the physics of that world, right? And science fiction, it's like, well, here's the physics that are extremely similar to our world, except that there's something that's different that allows the technology to work that we don't go into, right? Or there's something that seems to get around the physics as we understand them, but the rest of it is hard physics. Then that actually begs the question: why is it that we run into this exponential problem with some hard magic systems? Or really, I think we could really say that all magic systems, as soon as we enter that word system, are hard magic. I think soft magics don't have systems. I think soft magic is symbolic and hard magic is magic systematized. But it seems
I'd
like,
agree with that myself.
yeah, right. It just kind of makes sense when we say it, like, you know, uh, but the question is like, why does that work in science fiction, and why does that not tend to work in more fantasy? It even works in science fantasy for that matter, but it does not seem to work so much in these kind of modern. Well, I say it doesn't work so much. These books are some of these books are extremely popular, so maybe I don't know what I'm talking about at all. But
Well, who
if I
does?
do, yeah, right. If we are correct in our pretentious disdain for a lot of hard magic in the way that we described it, what's the difference? Why does it work in some settings and not in more fantastical settings?
I think because in the case of sci-fi, you're still tethered to the laws of reality. I mean, that's a poor way to phrase it, but I would struggle to think of an example in sci-fi where you can essentially make something happen out of nothing, because that's kind of what magic is in a more, if you're talking a high fantasy hard magic setting, kind of just the more you try to add to it, the more you try to add categories and powers, and you keep expanding on what it's capable of, then it balloons into, well, it can do anything at any time, and this is the problem I
Okay.
alluded to before. It can do anything, anywhere, anytime. Whereas you're not essentially just, you know, pulling shit out of thin air in sci-fi, that you're generally not going to run into that problem because it's still got to be based in material reality, whereas magic isn't.
Yeah. Oh, you just clicked it together for me. So, are you familiar with the idea that a bureaucracy, once it comes into being, it will very quickly stop serving its function, and its function will then become to perpetuate itself?
Yes, I too have heard of the FBI.
And the CIA, and the NSA, and now we're dead. Um, um,
Okay, I got
but
a few tools within reach.
I need to get mine out of my bedroom. All I have right now is a sword. Um, I
That'll
guess
freak them
that
out
as
even
my
more.
yeah, I guess in my tiny apartment it's just as good. But yeah, so that idea of the bureaucracy, I think that when it comes to say something like science fiction, even science fantasy, naturally there is a desire for the quote unquote hard magical element to be very, very, very constrained and very subtly implemented, and then essentially like not left to be developed on and not to be excessively focused on. And so it stays small, right? It's sort of like uh, the idea of a like how you would hope a bureaucracy would function. But there is something about the more fantastical that once you, and perhaps it's because the setting itself is, I keep thinking focus on the fantasy, but that doesn't seem exactly right. Either way, what I'm seeing here is once your magic system is the centerpiece around which conflicts are resolved, it's like the center tool. It becomes a tool that gets so big that naturally it grows like a bureaucracy, and it gets out of your hands because its desire is itself to expand, because that's what systems do, right? Like the system as it maybe you have this experience as a writer, like while you're in the trenches, while you're writing, you're not going along, you might be going along with an outline, but a lot of the time it's like the thoughts come to you, and if you and you give the characters in a sense your agency to write them, like you sit in their bodies and then you go to make them believable. But what if we do that to the magic system? Like we give the magic system our agency as authors, right? And then if we do that too much, like a bureaucracy, it just grows so that it becomes the story and the story goes by the wayside.
Hmm. I found that problem actually myself, where the setting for my first book, which I'm really no longer developing, I was trying to take that same approach to categorize magic, and I found, intending to narrow it down to, I meant to have just like four or five or six categories of magic, kind of like what's in the Elder Scrolls, where you've got destruction, alteration, illusion, so forth. But it's like, oh, but then what about this possibility, and what about that, and then you end up with six categories, and then each of them having three different subcategories, and yeah, it just gets nuts.
Yeah, it just happens, right? Like it just like it wants to happen because we want to understand it. Um, I started to encounter that a little bit with my own work with wand smoke. And you could tell me if I was able to avoid it. Um, what I tried to do was I tried to say, okay, the characters in this world try to categorize magic, but as soon as I started, I thought they are wrong. Like I'm assuming that everyone as they try to describe magic to the reader, they don't know what they're talking about. So they're talking about one thing and they are trying to define it in a way that's useful to them, and therefore their categories are always a little bit wonky. They're always a little bit not exactly correct and overlapping. And my hope was when I did that, it wouldn't it wouldn't feel arbitrary, but it would also not feel like a system. Like it would feel like they're trying to make this a system, but there's no bureaucracy here. Like, do you think for Wandsmoke in particular, I was able to uh, convey that?
I think you did, with a point of people trying to define magic. You've got, was it, is it the Apothecaries Guild, or one of the guilds that ends up setting up shop in the south, where they're doing all kinds of experiments all the time, and then Canty, who's just sitting by himself in a cave, he ends up essentially becoming more powerful than any of them, except maybe perhaps Domnall, but I'm not familiar with the extent of his power. Likewise, you have the champions of the church, where they have some magic they're capable of, but their understanding of that power is completely different to what Canty's understanding of his power is, except for some philosophical parallels that I recall he ends up making with one of the champions. He ends up expressing the idea in such a way that one of the champions is able to understand. There's some overlap between the ideas, but like you said, it's not going to be categorized. It's not going to be strictly categorized in the way the people practicing it wish it would be.
Yeah, right. Like so, the champions, the shield maidens, are like, here, this is the will of the divine. So you might call it like
Mm-hmm.
divine magic, and the Conti is like, yeah, I think that shit might be a cult too. And I
Well,
think
if you want to
the
tie it
out,
back to our if you want to tie it back to our previous conversation when we talked about truth, where um, I think in a way, the way I express this best, it's all them fighting over the truth essentially. With this is the truth of power, or this is the truth of my power.
yeah, it's really interesting because it parallels something that I think I experience a lot, and you probably experience it quite a lot too. Um, for those of you who are really here for the writing, this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but it ties right in, trust me. So over on the Wild Isle Discord server, the Wild Isle Workshop, I have a little section called the Grand Salon, and sometimes really um, spicy social and political conversations happen there when it's too late in the evening and I really shouldn't be posting anything anywhere because I my inhibitions go down in the evening. Uh, but we have some fun conversations. And one of our friends posted a clip of Yoon talking, and we started talking about the concept of enantiodromia. And one of our good friends, who happens to be a like I think fundamentalist, like creationist Christian, who I really like, brings up the seven deadly sins, and then with no trouble at all, um, let's say me, the weird, I don't even know what I am. I like ostensibly I'm an atheist, but like I take a lot into the I give a lot of credence to the symbolism and I tie that into psychology. And then also, like Jordan Peterson to be like, "You're not an atheist, you believe in God." Or you act as though you believe in God. And it's like, all right, Jordan, I'm not really
You better
attached.
believe you believe in God, Bucko.
Yeah, right. But there's some parallel there, right? Where he brings up the seven deadly sins, and I'm like, yeah, that works perfectly. And like, here's the situation I just laid out, worded within the context of the sins. And then what that means is that there's something external to both of us, right? That our friend would call God. That I actually I'll call it God too if anyone wants. I'm not really attached. I don't really care at this point in my life. But right, but like if I wanted to be secular about it, I would say like the objective reality. If I was Taoist, I would call it the Tao. It doesn't matter to me. Um, but there is the idea again coming back to the source of soft magic that there is a thing outside ourselves to which we can be in accord with to gain essentially benefit from because we're navigating in alignment with it as opposed to against its will. And you see this overlap of what should really be conflicting, let's say in our case, in real life, religious beliefs. And if we are in a fantasy universe, it would be like we come from different like schools of magic, but then the schools of magic should conflict and then don't. You see where I'm getting at with that, like how that
Only thing where we're arriving now is at the Joseph Campbell argument, the hero with a thousand faces, where it's a thousand different ways to express the same ideas that are core to our humanity.
yes. And I think that that is what soft magic is in fiction. Think I'm overstating that?
Soft magic is the hero with a thousand faces.
Yeah, it's the same spirit that animates the hero across his thousand faces. It's the appeal to that is which is the thing outside ourself, right? It is the yeah. Oh, I could go on and on saying the same thing over and over. And to add on to that, I would say hard magic is often the construction of an Akulikon, if you've played Morrowind, which is the Akulikon is a giant, essentially steampunk robot that the dwarves are building to conquer the whole island and set themselves up as gods, right? And I think that's what hard magic is. Hard magic is the robot that we can set up so that we can system master it and it can solve all our problems, but it always gets out of our control.
You're onto something there.
Maybe. I don't know how useful that'll be to the authors out there listening. This is kind of a more wild podcast. It, that's quite all right. So I have in here like a kind of which do you prefer question, but it sounds to me that we both kind of land quite firmly in the soft magic camp.
Yeah, like I said, that's the approach I'm taking to it myself, and the stories I currently have in development. Especially given what we've touched on in this conversation, I don't know that I would try my hand at hard magic.
Yeah, it sounds. Why don't you go, if you're comfortable, a little bit more into the what was going to end up being like a foray that was getting to hard that it seems like you moved away from, right? So you were like, okay, I'm coming into this. There are like six different classifications of magic, and then you started to see, oh, okay, this is getting out of hand. What was that like, and what did you end up doing with that?
It's hard to remember because it was so long ago. I just remember jotting it in from. I think I might still have it in the notebook. It's written in nearby. 'Cause it was an attempt at trying to define what magic is. I actually gave an answer for what magic is in my first book. Um, and then trying to categorize what it's capable of, and going into the same problem we've talked about a couple of times now, where I would try to break down all the categories, all the different things it might be capable of, and then it's like, oh no, now I have a dozen different categories. What am I going to do with this? And that maybe kind of just made it look like a fool's errand.
Yeah, and I've read too many books where that does end up being the case where like you realize as you're looking at it, it's like okay, this is just too much, where people just put it all out there, and it drags. It's like slow. It's very slow reading. It's not just slow, but it feels wrong. It just it feels as though I'm not reading a book. I'm reading a game. Do you think that is and also I don't notice this same trend that we have for like hard magic in fantasy novels now. It doesn't seem to be present at all the older the works are. And I'm curious if it is not tabletop games and video games that are responsible for the proliferation of this in the genre. Do you think that that's the culprit? I just don't know where else it might come from.
That could be because with the way a video game has to be designed, it's inevitable you're going to have to categorize things, for like you said, for balancing purposes. Um, Whereas if you're trying to do a soft magic system in a game, it could work where you could have just a handful of powers that the hero is capable of, but you inevitably have to at the very least tie it to a mana bar or something, and then make them upgradable or yeah. As for uh, yeah, you could be on point with that. I'm not sure. I'm not well read enough to give a argument one way or the other.
Um, I mean, yeah, it's to be honest, I could be better at. I'm getting better at reading more novels all the time, but no, I think because if you think of how a soft magic system works, you could do it in a tabletop game if you had a really great group of players, right? Where you could trust each other to invent spells and things, and negotiate out how they're going to work in the game. But if you do that, like the what's going to end up happening, I think, is if you end up with any sort of player versus player conflict, and they're going to want it to be adjudicatable in some numeric fashion. Okay, all of a sudden now everything has to get harder right away, right? And the reason why is because there's a desire for it to not be an arbitrary judgment. And there's a desire that go back to that will to power between the two players. We're in conflict with one another. Each of our wills is a desire to succeed over the other. How are we going to come to terms with this? And because it's a game um, that is really divorced from any, let's say, almost any action, right? Like a lot of these games, it's very difficult to involve skill. You could do like a little bit of tactics based stuff, but it ends up being very simplistic. And the more complicated you make it, the slower and clunkier, particular tabletop games it gets. So then you end up with these hard number systems, and that solves a lot of your problems. Uh, but also it's not really magic, right? At that, or it becomes less and less and less magical the more we start to incorporate numbers, and it becomes interchangeable with something that isn't magical, right? Like the fireball spell is not really that different than a grenade. Yeah, right. Well, in terms of like if you're playing a game, right? Like if you reskinned either tabletop or video game characters, and one shot a fireball out and it did fire damage, and the other threw a grenade, and let's say it's particularly not a fragmentation grenade, but like some type of what's the word for it? There is a word for this.
Incendiary, white phosphorus.
Incendiary. There we go. Incendiary grenade. Thank you, Brad. Uh, yeah, it would effectively like you wouldn't have to make it any different. Uh, in fact, if you're playing Dark Souls, you could throw a firebomb, which is an oil pot with like a lit rag, or you could throw a fireball using the pyromancy spell, and is it different? Really? Like you throw a thing, it does fire damage when it hits the enemy. That's I think the harder the magic system gets. That's what we're reducing to now in a game. Maybe that's okay because you're there for the game for other reasons, and that's perhaps getting into a different conversation. But when it comes to a novel, you don't have those other reasons. Not really. And yet these things are so popular. Why do you think that is?
Why the hard magic systems are so popular?
Yeah, like I'm even ghostwriting for a lit RPG, and I just like disparaged the whole. I guess we could call it a subgenre. I would call it a setting, but that doesn't matter, right? But like they're definitely really popular. You go on Amazon, you can see tons of them everywhere. A ton of fantasy novels, like the Mistborn series for Brandon Sanderson, is famous for using a very hard magic system. Um, and Brandon Sanderson is a very popular author, and I imagine he uses such type of hard magic systems in his other works. Um, they seem to sell well, yet in the way that we've discussed them, they seem to not be good for literature and good for games. So why is it that they're selling well?
Flashy appeal, maybe they're so popular among um, they might be popular among starting writers because again, like I said before, they want to get they think they're going to get on top of the expanding out of control problem. They think they're going to imposing limitations on it is going to work. It could just be they're getting lost in world building. It could just be simple escapism, wish fulfillment, whatever. I don't want to play armchair psychologist and say, oh, Brandon Sanderson is doing this or that thing, and how he expresses these symbols in his stories and what the purpose of that is. That's a whole rabbit hole I'm just not prepared to delve down.
Honestly, neither am I. I need to read more of his work. Yeah, like the only thing I could come up with is that these things remind a lot of readers of the other things that they like, right? So like the lit RPG one is easy. Like tons of people play these video games. They want to read about a character. They would essentially live vicariously through a character who succeeds through being good at a video game. The video games use hard magic systems, therefore that works. I have another idea because there's another note that I wrote down here that I can't believe I missed this whole like hour of the conversation. Um, so soft magic I think, is open ended problem solving, whereas hard magic is closed ended problem solving. Are you familiar with the terms open ended problem and closed ended problem solving?
I've not heard them before, but I think I can kind of intuit what they mean.
Go ahead and give me your impression.
It would have to do with how many different solutions you have to the problem that's in front of you, I would think.
It does go on. Well, not to put you on the spot then. You are right. It
Again,
does have to do with the number. But with a closed ended problem, essentially you have a limitation not just of options but of potential solutions, like the win condition is a predetermined goal or one of a very few predetermined goals, and the pathways to get there are therefore much more restrictive, whereas if it's an open-ended problem, in part you kind of decide what the problem is, and you kind of just you it's really up to you to determine whether or not that problem is resolved, and therefore the pathways in a sense are infinite insofar as the goal can move, and the goal is also not determined for you. And I think real life, like real life, is an open-ended problem. And I think I have like all of the existentialists to kind of back that up, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't have anyone asking like, what is the purpose of being, right? Like why am I on this earth? What is my goal? Like, you know, but I think as particularly in the modern day, we go through school. School is a closed-ended problem. You need to get these grades, you need to pass these tests, you need to write these papers in this way. This is how you do it, you succeed. All right, like work often for most people is a series of closed-ended problems, right? You do the task is either done or not done. Some people are lucky. You could say that we're like, you could also say that we're unfortunate if we are able to pursue, let's say, some type of career as authors, because that's an open-ended problem, right? Because you could say like, yeah, you need to write books that like sell, but like not really. It's like you need to write books that you actually want to keep writing, and maybe your goal just isn't to sell. Maybe your goal is to uh, write things that impact people in a deep way. Like maybe your goal is to have a legacy, so after you die, that you're considered a great author. And then all of a sudden, you realize, oh yeah, life is an open-ended thing. It's not just do I make money or do I not. But a lot of the times, it's not that, right? Like you go into a corporate office, it's like maybe that's all you're thinking. And when you play a game, games have to be closed-ended problems because you can't maybe AI will change this, but you can't have a game with an open-ended problem solving because you can't program for that.
To
And
account for an
so,
infinite number of variables and an infinite number of outcomes, and that's just, as far as I understand it, it's just not doable.
yeah, that's exactly it. But that's like the world we live in now, right? Like our entertainment is all closed-ended problem solving. Most of our work experiences that, our school experiences that, increasingly our life experiences that. Because if you have a family, that's an open-ended problem. That gets complicated fast. But if you're an atomized individual where really you just need to eat and be sheltered, oh, that's a closed-ended problem. That's easy. Do you have a roof over your head? Yes. Like, are you getting enough food to not starve to death? Yes. Um, I think that we have become accustomed to the restriction of possible goals, and therefore our minds are geared toward and get pleasure from seeking essentially different forms of system mastery, and that the hard magic in these particular types of fantasy stories appeals to that, right? It appeals to the person who wants to feel like, yes, I can figure out or understand how these systems work, therefore I can achieve success.
Could very well be the case.
Yeah, and I find it to be very different than, let's say, I don't know if you go read Oedipus Rex, like what's the goal, right? Like, okay, ostensibly the goal is to find out whoever cursed this city and then exile him. Except when you find out that like maybe it's you and you're the person who cursed the city for the thing that you did, and then now like how do you make a redemption for it? Like all of a sudden you're hard. You see what I mean? Like there's something unlifelike about the well, actually, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I shouldn't say that hard magic is not representative of life. It is very representative of the modern, like of modernity. That's kind of spooky. I don't know. I might be going off on a limb here. I've gone off many limbs, it seems. The hanging man from the tree.
I wonder if it's just the case that hard magic is an attempt to understand the unknowable, and soft magic is an acknowledgement that we can't understand the unknowable.
I mean, I would say yes to that on impulse. I might modify it. How about I like soft magic, the or relinquishing of trying to know that which cannot be known, right? That's like the Tao, right? The Tao that can be named is not the true Tao, meaning like we can't know that is which is because we are trapped within our perceptions, and therefore that which is outside is always going to be outside. But instead of I don't think hard magic is an attempt to know that. I think that hard magic is the assumption that we do.
Or the assumption that we can.
I don't think it's can. I think it's do, right? Like, have you ever talked to the really annoying, very, let's say, ostensibly science-minded person? So this would be like your secular, progressive person who has an extreme, high degree of education, particularly in the sciences.
I don't really know many people like that in real life.
Oh, well, if you have the fortune or misfortune to talk to such a person, um, what you'll find is they will speak as though they think like scientists. They don't, right? So they are able to perform the procedure that is required of their work, but they are otherwise utterly arrogant in all their other thinking, and they have no actual sense of skepticism about them, right? So like if they believe something, they believe it as firmly as if they have a mountain of research behind it. And they think that way because they're like, well, I'm a scientist and I do scientific work. Therefore, I must be the perfect rational being, and therefore I don't have these silly superstitious monkey beliefs. My beliefs are all predicated in facts. when in reality they make a number of assumptions they're not aware of. Typically, they are not philosophically sophisticated to understand the rationality used to derive information from the data. Like they have this weird thing where they just think the data speaks. And it's like, no, it doesn't, you dummy. That's why this part of your paper is called an interpretation. Um, but yeah, that type of individual, it's like they'll say to you like, I am trying to strive after the truth. But then when you ask them what they think, there is like no doubt, like none at all. It's like they're Gnostics of their beliefs.
Hmm.
And I think like when I think of hard magic, that's what that's like. Like if X then Y, or if X plus Y then Z. And I know that that's the case, and I understand it, and I can control it with
Hmm.
consistency. But again, maybe I'm just bashing hard magic way more than I should. All right, Brad. I think we've stretched this conversation as far as we're going to be able to, unless there's something else that I missed that you want to cover.
Not that comes to mind. I think I said most of what I had to say, bumbled my way through it.
All right, friends, fellow philosophers, we will wrap this up. Do not forget to check out uh, Brad's work on codename Wraith over on Minds and King's Wrath. I got it right that time, yes?
Yes, well done.
Yeah, King's Wrath over on YouTube. Give them 1,000 likes, subscribes, share their samples, scream at them to get out of their stalling period and make more music. Um,
Just help us find a fucking singer.
Help them find a singer. uh, desperately help them find a singer. I want to see their music out there so I can purchase it and see them play live and all kinds of fun things. Also, go check out wildowlet.com. Particularly, check out the editing service if you are interested. I'm really excited about being able now to offer subscriptions. I think it can help quite a number of people really get their works done. I know it's very, the long, arduous process of writing a novel and developing skill is miserable by yourself. So you don't have to do it alone. Also, I should have mentioned at the beginning, maybe I'll add a little bit about this in post. I'm going to be relaunching my Kickstarter campaign to fund a bunch of book covers that I wanted to fund before and I didn't get it. So I'm going to go harder this time and ask for more. So be on the lookout for that. The pre launch page is up. If you know how to find me on social media, you'll see it. I'll be promoting it until you're sick of hearing about it. But it'll be great because I know a couple authors who are not authors. Well, they will. One is an author actually, but also artists who are excellent, and I want to put money in their pockets to commission their work so that they can further their careers, so I can further my career, and I can write more books, and then we can all be happier with our stories. So wildislet.com, keep up there. Sign up to my damn mailing list because I'm just going to email you guys this stuff and you won't miss it. That's it. Thank you guys. Check out Brad's stuff, and I will see you next time.